A coffee shop in the mist. The morning mist curled around the quiet streets of the small town, veiling the cobblestone paths in a haze of soft gray. The air was crisp and damp, carrying with it the subtle scent of rain from the night before. Everything felt suspended in time. The outlines of buildings blurred, the occasional street lamp flickering dimly against the mist, and the distant sound of water gently lapping against the docks. Sophia pulled her scarf a little tighter around her neck, walking at an unhurried pace. She had grown accustomed to the town's morning mist, how it would roll in before sunrise, turning familiar streets into a dreamlike landscape. It was a kind of quiet she had not known in the city she had left behind, a quiet that invited her to slow down, to breathe. This town had become a retreat for her, away from the rush of deadlines, from the noise of the world beyond. Here, she had found a place where time moved differently, where she could sit and write without distraction, without urgency. Ahead, the warm glow of a coffee shop's light spilled onto the street, a beacon of familiarity in the mist. It was the only place in town open this early, and over the past few weeks, it had become part of her morning ritual. Stepping inside, she was immediately wrapped in the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The air inside was warm, carrying the comforting scent of roasted beans and caramelized sugar. The wooden floors creaked faintly beneath her steps, the soft hum of a jazz melody playing in the background. The cafe wasn't large, but it had a certain charm. Wooden shelves lined with coffee beans in neatly labeled glass jars, small round tables arranged near the windows, and a long counter where the owner stood, methodically preparing each cup. Sophia made her way to her usual seat by the window, setting her scarf over the chair and placing her leather notebook on the table. She had come to cherish these quiet mornings, just her, a warm cup of coffee, and the slow rhythm of the town waking up outside. She reached for her bag, intending to go to the counter to place her order. But before she could stand, a freshly brewed cup of black coffee was placed in front of her. She paused, looking up at the man who had set it down. Lucas, the cafe's owner, stood on the other side of the table, his expression calm as always.
The weather calls for a different blend today.
Sophia glanced down at the cup, watching the delicate wisps of steam rise. The aroma was subtly different, less bitter, carrying a faint, almost floral note.
This isn't what I usually order.
It is not.
She hesitated, then wrapped her hands around the cup, letting its warmth seep into her palms. Lifting it to her lips, she took a small sip. The flavor was smoother than her usual selection, less bold, more layered, with hints of caramel and citrus. It was unexpected, yet comforting.
What kind of beans are these?
Ethiopian Yirgacheffe. Fruity undertones, a little softer than what you usually get. Thought you might like to try something different.
She lowered the cup slightly, considering his words.
You always decide what your customers should drink?
Only for those who order the same thing every day. Sometimes, change is good.
A quiet laugh escaped her lips. She wasn't sure if it was the warmth of the coffee or the subtle humor in his tone, but something about the exchange made her feel a little lighter. Outside, the mist remained thick, blurring the outlines of passers-by into fleeting shadows. The town felt even quieter than usual, as if the world beyond this cafe had momentarily ceased to exist. She turned her gaze back to her notebook, flipping open the cover. The pages were filled with half-written sentences, stray thoughts, and scenes waiting to be completed. She tapped the end of her pen against the paper, letting the warmth of the cafe settle around her. Lucas didn't say anything else. He simply returned to the counter, resuming his quiet routine. His presence was unobtrusive, yet grounding, like the steady rhythm of a familiar song. Sophia wrote a few words, then paused, glancing once more toward the misty streets beyond the window. Sometimes, change wasn't something you sought out. Sometimes, it found you in the smallest of moments. The morning mist was denser than usual, thick veils of white hanging low over the town, muting colors and blurring the familiar outlines of buildings and streets. The glow of streetlights appeared softer, their light diffused into golden halos that flickered gently in the fog. Footsteps on the damp cobblestone roads were hushed, and figures moved like shadows, their forms dissolving into the mist as they passed. Sophia sat by the cafe window, fingers tracing absent-mindedly over the worn leather cover of her notebook. The pages inside were filled with half-written lines and fragments of ideas. Yet, as she stared at them now, none seemed to connect. The mist outside made everything feel distant and undefined, and her thoughts mirrored this uncertainty, drifting without form, eluding capture. She exhaled softly, tapping the tip of her pen against the paper, waiting for inspiration to take shape. But nothing came.
The mist is heavier today than it was yesterday.
His voice carried through the quiet cafe, calm and unhurried. Sophia looked up, watching as he stood behind the counter, carefully pouring steaming water over freshly ground coffee. The mist outside curled around the window, blending with the rising swirls of steam from his cup, as if reality and dream were interwoven in that fleeting moment.
Mist slows time down.
It also makes it easier to lose your way.
She turned her gaze back to the window, watching the way the town seemed to fade into nothingness. The mist wrapped around everything, making the world feel suspended, isolated. For a brief moment, it was as if only she and this coffee shop existed. A moment later, Lucas placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of her. The deep, rich aroma filled the air, darker than her morning blend, carrying the bold scent of citrus and dark chocolate. The contrast was striking, as if the drink itself was a counterbalance to the pale, shapeless world outside.
Try this one. It'll help clear your thoughts.
Sophia wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. She took a sip, the bold flavors coating her tongue, strong yet smooth, bitter yet balanced by a subtle fruitiness. It was different from what she usually drank, but somehow it felt right for this moment.
Lucas, do you think mist can change things?
Lucas didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted past the window, studying the street beyond, now barely visible through the thick fog.
Mist doesn't change anything. It only hides things for a while. But sometimes, when you can't see clearly, you have to stop and think about where you really want to go.
Sophia absorbed his words, fingers lightly tapping the edge of her notebook.
My story is about a traveler who gets lost in a thick mist.
Lucas raised an eyebrow slightly, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. His attention shifted to the open notebook on the table.
And then,
Sophia turned a page, running her fingertips over the inked lines. Her story was forming, piece by piece, just like the mist slowly lifting in the distance.
He arrives at a small town, hoping to find a way out, but no one can give him the answer. He keeps walking, unable to see where he's going, until he stumbles upon a little cafe.
Lucas leaned back slightly, his fingers drumming lightly against the wooden surface of the table.
and is there someone inside?
She gave a small, knowing smile as she closed her notebook.
Yes, a shop owner. He doesn't tell the traveler which way to go. Instead, he hands him a cup of hot coffee and says, "Just wait. Let the mist clear on its own."
Lucas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lifted his own cup, taking a slow sip before setting it back down, a quiet smile touching his lips.
Sometimes stopping is the only way to know where to go next.
Sophia said nothing, but this time, when she lowered her gaze to her notebook, her pen moved with certainty. Outside, the mist remained thick, shrouding the town in its quiet embrace. But inside, in the warmth of the cafe, her story was taking shape, one word at a time. The morning mist still lingered, clinging to the quiet streets like a sheer veil, though it had begun to thin. The outlines of buildings gradually emerged from the haze, their edges no longer blurred. Streetlights, once reduced to muted halos, now cast long, defined shadows onto the damp cobblestone roads. The world beyond the cafe window was returning to its usual clarity, but the mist had not yet entirely lifted. Sophia set her pen down, exhaling slowly. She had spent the last hour writing, her words flowing more steadily than they had in days. Her story, much like the shifting mist outside, was starting to take shape. The traveler in her pages remained lost in the fog, uncertain of where to go. The coffee shop owner in the story, silent yet perceptive, offered nothing but a warm drink, a quiet space to think, and the assurance that the mist would eventually clear. Outside, the mist was indeed clearing. Yet, as she watched the world come back into focus, a thought settled in her mind. What if she wasn't simply writing a story? She had thought of this town as a temporary stop, a quiet place to write before she moved on. But as the days passed, as she sat in this same cafe each morning, she found herself questioning that assumption. Had she come here to write, or had she been looking for something else entirely?
If the mist never clears, does that mean the traveler will never find his way?
Lucas was standing behind the counter, polishing a ceramic coffee cup, his movements slow and deliberate. The rhythmic sound of his cloth against the cup was soft, barely audible over the gentle hum of the cafe. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze momentarily flicking toward the window. where the mist still curled in soft tendrils along the edges of the buildings.
The mist always clears, but the traveler has to decide where he wants to go, not just wait for the path to appear.
Sophia drummed her fingers lightly against the cover of her notebook. That was the difference, wasn't it? The traveler in her story was waiting for direction, assuming that once the mist lifted, the answer would be obvious. But maybe answers didn't come that way. Maybe, instead of waiting for certainty, the traveler needed to choose his own path. Maybe she did too. For weeks, she had told herself that she was merely passing through, that her stay in this town was temporary, but she hadn't booked her next train ticket. She hadn't mapped out her next destination. The truth was, she had stopped moving forward without realizing it.
Do you think the traveler will leave in the end?
Sophia glanced down at the page she had just written.
Maybe he'll stay.
Lucas didn't look surprised. Instead, he reached for a fresh cup, pouring a new blend of coffee. The rich aroma filled the air, deeper and more robust than the one she had earlier. He slid the cup toward her, steam curling gently in the space between them.
Then let him stay.
Sophia picked up the cup, holding it between her hands, feeling the warmth seep into her skin. The scent was rich, with hints of caramel and toasted nuts, grounding and steadying. She let out a quiet breath, a small smile touching her lips.
But the story isn't over yet.
Lucas gave a small nod, watching as she turned to a fresh page in her notebook.
Then keep writing.
Sophia lowered her pen, the ink gliding effortlessly over the paper this time. The traveler's story had more pages yet to be filled, more choices yet to be made, and perhaps so did hers. Outside, the mist continued to lift, revealing more of the town with each passing moment. The cobblestone paths regained their familiar textures, the outlines of shop fronts sharpened, the world returning to its usual clarity. The cafe remained a quiet haven, warm and unhurried, and as Sophia wrote, she realized, this morning, this place, this feeling, it was exactly where she was meant to be. The mist had begun to clear.